Welcome everyone to another episode of Battle Tips. You guys thought this episode was never coming? Well, it is. In this episode, we're planning to talk about something that I keep reminding all of you to never forget. In this video, we're going to talk about what the special action is, the different phases of the game wherein the special actions can be played, as well as the specific special actions that you can do using the special action card. Now, the special action card is a card that you play as a style, and upon reveal, has three very different special actions depending on which base you play within. I'll go over those later on. Now, this card basically allows you to control the pace of the game or change the board state in a risk-free manner. Most of the time, the special action is your most powerful possible attack that you can play. Even more powerful than your clockwork shots and your stalwart dividers. The special action is an indomitable force that oftentimes dictates the way your opponents play, and of course, dictates the way you play. Now, in order to further understand the special action, it's very, very important that you understand the three phases of any BattleCon game. First up is the early game. Now, the early game is characterized by neither you or the opponent having any distinct advantages. This is usually beats 1, 2, and 3. The use of the special action at this point in time is at its riskiest, but at the same time at its most rewarding. Because if you do pull it off correctly, you are able to basically control the pace of the game and gain the immediate advantage, allowing you to snowball into the late game. When you use the special action at this point in time, basically allows you to dictate the mid game and the late game, as well as give you an immense advantage, allowing you to get the most life loss on your opponent. However, the risk and of course the obvious weakness is the fact that if you do whiff it, you won't have your special action for later moments in the game where you desperately need it to bail you out of certain situations. So when using it in the early game, remember, it is absolutely devastating, but at the same time, it is incredibly risky. Now, the mid-game is not any specific number of beats. It's basically the point in time that happens after the early game, but before the late game comes along. Usually, the mid-game is characterized by one side having some form of advantage over the other. Be that because of positioning, resources, health totals, so on, so forth. Now, the use of the special action in this point in the game is simply twofold. If you're the guy with the advantage, you can use the special action to immediately jettison the game into the late game, where you want to be, because late game means you'll be killing someone in a short while. On the other hand, if you're on the losing side of that equation, you will use the special action to make the ground even, or possibly even giving you the advantage. In that sense, you can use it as a tempo play or as a means of catching up if you're losing immensely. The special action is its least impactful during the mid-game, but also its most safe. Because in the mid-game, people don't actually expect you to play your special action because it's so close to the late game that you might as well save it for then. However, it's very reliable in that sense because opponents don't see it coming most of the time. However, it's its least impactful because if you're winning a lot, you don't really need to spend the special action to get in the late game because you're already winning. And on the other hand, if you're losing a lot, you don't want to spend it now because you'll need it in the late game, because in the late game, that's when you need it to bail you out of instant-death situations. So be thoughtful about using the special action during the mid-game. Finally, we have the late game. The late game happens when one of the two players participating in a duel is 1 or 2 hits to death. That means that the late game can come as early as beats 4 and 6, depending on how fast and how hard you two hit each other. The late game is very important because basically it's the phase that will determine who wins the game. The special action is very potent at this point in the game, but for reasons that aren't as impactful as playing it in the early game is. You see, if you're on the winning side of the equation in the late game, it means that you're gonna use your special action to kill the opponent. That's the greatest benefit you can have, but again, that's only for like 1 or 2 beats, so it's not as impactful as the early game, where the benefit spreads throughout the entire game. On the other hand, if you're on the losing side of that equation, you are going to use your special action to not die. You're going to use it to negate your opponent's options that will insta-give you, and even counter their special action if they decide to kill you with theirs. Remember that the greatest risk here is that it is the most predictable to play the special action in the late game. Because in the late game, special actions are more prevalent because that's when overdrives can start happening, and that's where people start canceling and pulsing and so on and so forth. Now, with that knowledge, remember that these 3 phases of the game have their advantages and disadvantages to playing the special action card. Early game is most impactful but more risky. Middle game is least impactful but somewhat more reliable. And late game ends the game or saves your life but is the most predictable. So be wary about those things and use your special action judiciously. Don't just play it whenever, because the moment you lose it, it kinda ruins the rest of the game for you. Trust me. Now, in talking about special actions, let's talk about the 3 things you can do with a special action. The overdrive finishers, cancels, and pulses. Overdrive finishers are basically these giant super attacks. Compare them to like ultra combos in Street Fighter or supers in Street Fighter. They're basically big bang attacks that you're going to do against your opponent to hopefully kill them or make up some lost ground. We actually have 3 kinds of finishers. Most finishers are actually categorized into one of 3 categories. We have threat of power finishers, game-ending finishers, as well as upgrade finishers. Now, we have to talk about each individual kind of finisher because almost every character has 2 of these kinds of finishers. Now, let's start off with threat of power finishers. Threat of power finishers are basically overdrives that are really, really strong. Like, literally overdrives that will end the game the moment they hit. Literally, things that do like 25 damage, or things that have effects that literally state you win the game if you play this right. Their biggest weakness is the fact that they are absolutely improbable to hit. Some of them have really awkward ranges, some of them have really bad stats, or some of them have really specific conditions. However, the benefit to them is immense. And the benefit doesn't actually come from playing the card. You see, threat of power is precisely that. Threat of power. Your opponent gets really scared because you have this option in your hand now. For example, the Dimensional Exile insta-kills anybody who decides to stay on Kadot's gate trap. This means that they're likely to want to get off the gate trap. And most characters that are slow and don't mind the priority penalty now have to care about being on the gate trap because it will absolutely destroy them if Dimensional Exile hits. Therefore, threat of power overdrive finishers are less about actually playing them to kill the opponent, but more of scaring your opponent into playing sub-optimally. These overdrive finishers are really great and one of my personal favorite kinds because you don't have to play the overdrive to benefit from it. Sometimes you can just loom it over your opponent's head and go like, I'm gonna do this. No, I'm gonna do this now, or I'm gonna do this then. That scares them, and that will affect the way they play, and more oftentimes it will cause them to play sub-optimally. You've already benefited from it without spending a single resource. It's amazing! And then you can use it as a cancel or a pulse, and they'll be scared and go like, whoa. Yeah, threat of power finishers are really powerful. Game-ending finishers. Now, game-ending finishers might sound like threat of power finishers, but they're really not. Game-ending finishers are, well, what they do. They end games. Not in the sense that, like threat of power finishers wherein they insta-kill opponents or deal 25 damage, but in the sense that they're actually good attacks. They have really good stats, really great hit confirm, devastating effects like on-stun, on-hit stuns, on-hit ignore stun guard, on-hit gain stun immunity, on-hit gain power plus 10, so on and so forth. These overdrive finishers are basically super powered regular attacks. And that doesn't mean that they're weak compared to the other kinds of overdrive finishers, but that means that they are really strong, and their greatest benefit is the fact that they can end the game for you. They're really powerful attacks. However, their greatest weakness is the fact that they're just that. powerful attacks. They don't have any benefit aside from just being a really OP, overpowered attack. So be careful because they're subject to the same restrictions that all other attack pairs have to go through. Range misses, dashes, and so on and so forth. Sometimes this is the riskiest overdrive that you can do because if you whiff, you gain absolutely no benefit from it at all. And finally, we have upgrade finishers. Upgrade finishers are finishers that don't do anything, quote and unquote, because usually they're attacks that don't hit or attacks that hit the opponent for no damage at all. But what's the benefit to them then? Well, the benefit to them is that they modify your character in some way, shape, or form. For example, characters like Hepzibah are able to start spending their opponent's lives instead of their own when using their unique ability, and so on and so forth. These kinds of overdrive finishers are scary because they have a certain element of both types of previous overdrive finishers. They have threat of power because they're weak attacks, and this basically scares your opponent because although they're weak attacks, the benefits you gain from playing them are incredible. So your opponent is therefore forced to become hyper-aggressive to stop you from gaining the benefit of this upgrade overdrive. So that sort of makes them play sub-optimally, though not as sub-optimally as threat of power finishers do. On the other hand, they're like regular attacks because, well, they have some way, shape, or form of letting you dodge or giving you defensive stats. Overall, they're really powerful if you get the bonus that they're going to provide, because this basically makes you a super powered version of yourself, allowing you to deal lots of damage or control the board or basically do whatever your character does, but 10 times better. The really great thing about it is that these types of overdrive finishers have the greatest comeback potential, allowing you to come back from even the most grievous of losses. However, their greatest weakness is the fact that as a regular attack, they're oftentimes really bad. They don't do anything, they just cause a stagnant beat at best. So be careful because you're having to play these at 7 HP or below. So if your opponent whacks you in the face hard enough when you play one of these overdrives, you're going to die and it's going to be pointless. Now that overdrive finishers are done, we can move on to cancel. Cancel is a hybrid offensive-defensive option, whereas overdrives are fully offensive options. Cancels allow you to get rid of one of your opponent's pesky attack pairs, putting it into their discard 1. This is very powerful because not only does it make it so that you have to forget about that attack for 1 beat, no, it does it for an extra beat while your cards are still, cycling through the discard. This is very potent because it allows you to basically fight an opponent who has 1 less style and 1 less base in his hand, bringing the total of possible attacks from 15 down to a measly 10. It's amazing, and it's very good for characters that like to option monger or predict their opponent's attacks. So brawlers and tricksters generally benefit from this type of overdrive a lot. However, it does have one distinct weakness, and that's the fact that you can get counter overdrive. When you play a cancel, you and your opponent play new attack pairs, and your opponent can therefore respond with his own special action, either leveling the field by playing another cancel or doing a pulse to absolutely just make you miss and waste your attack. So be careful when playing this special action first. And then we move on to pulse. If overdrives are fully offensive, and cancels were hybrid offensive-defensive, pulse is the ultimate defensive pentagon of the special actions. Basically, it allows you to deny your opponent's attack and then rearrange the board however you like. This is very powerful, albeit somewhat similar to cancel. It does give you the great benefit of basically moving the characters around into whatever configuration you like. This might not sound too powerful at first, but it's really a big game changer, especially when you have characters that require good positioning and good board control to work, therefore making characters that are zoners or characters that have markers on the board much more likely to play this kind of overdrive finisher. Now, what's its greatest weakness? It's the same thing as cancel. The moment you play a pulse, the beat kind of ends and then it goes to the next beat. Your opponent can then reply with his own pulse and then put you back in the same position you were in earlier. making your entire pulse special action pointless. Therefore, like the cancel, it's very, very bad to play this special action first, so wait your opponent's out before playing yours. Now we'll go on to some general tips of how special actions should be played or what you should be looking out when doing special actions. Tip number 1, don't play your special action first unless it's a finisher. Playing your special action first is really bad because most of the time, well, actually all the time, your opponent can and has the option to just counter special action you. If you cancel, he'll cancel. If you pulse, he'll pulse, which basically negates the special action that you just did, making it absolutely terrible. Therefore, the special action war is kind of like nuclear war. You don't want to shoot first. You wait for your opponent, then you shoot back at them. That's where it's most effective because you know it won't get countered. There are a few exceptions, obviously. Finishers are a big exception because they work like regular attack pairs, so your opponent can't respond to them immediately. And of course, there's an exception of using the special action to gain tempo or momentum in the early game. Doing so allows you to basically control the pace of the game, even if your opponent decides to use their special action afterwards, because you can then follow that up by playing a really bad attack so that they'll cancel or pulse a bad attack. You still have good options left for the next beat. That's basically it. Don't play the special action first unless you're really, really good at this game. And by good, I mean you've played like 100 games or so. Number 2, don't be obvious with it. The moment your opponent sees the special action coming, the special action becomes pointless. If they know the overdrive's coming, they're gonna counter it. If they know the cancel's coming, they're gonna play a bad attack. If they know pulse is coming, they're gonna play a bad attack. Either way, the more obvious you are, the worse the special action gets. So get creative and be unpredictable. Number 3, know your 2 hierarchies. There are 2 hierarchies we have to talk about. Number 1 is the resolution hierarchy. The resolution hierarchy basically says that mechanically speaking, this overdrive takes precedence over that special action, over that special action, over that special action. So the hierarchy goes like this. Pulses, cancels, overdrives. So when fighting your opponent's special action card, remember this hierarchy, because if you play a cancel against their overdrive finisher, you'll win. But if they play a pulse against your cancel, you'll lose. So be wary about that and take note of all of those special interactions. I'll link the FAQ to that in the description down below if you guys are more curious about it. And then there's the hierarchy of usefulness, which is my personal scale and nobody need to necessarily agree with me. This hierarchy of usefulness basically is dictated by how often I decide to play a special action. Most of the time, the hierarchy goes like this. I usually play cancels, pulses, and overdrive finishers last. Cancels get more use because they basically let you win 2 beats instead of just 1, because of the fact that your opponent has less styles and bases in his hand, which is very, very good. Pulses aren't used that much because, well, again, they can get counterpulsed easily and positioning rarely matters, especially if you're really good at managing your cards. And finally, finishers get used last because they're just over-glorified regular attacks, which means that they're just as likely to miss and get countered and so on and so forth. And I like reliability in my attacks, so finishers get used least often. So remember those 2 hierarchies. Mechanical hierarchy in terms of precedence, and as well as the usefulness hierarchy that is on my personal scale, and you may have different opinions. Number 4, know your character. Knowing your character's strengths and weaknesses allow you to basically figure out which sort of special action you want to do. If your character is a certain type of character that has really, really amazing overdrives to the point that they seem unfair, like Runica for example, you might want to prioritize finishers over cancel and pulse. Or if your character is a kind of character that doesn't need to option monger or get enough spacing, overdrives become way more tasty looking because you suddenly have this great attack that you didn't have before. Basically, characters that don't have really awesome attacks but have really awesome overdrive finishers are usually the ones who play overdrive finishers. Now, how about characters that are brawlers? So, you know, they like option mongering and taking advantage of opponents' lack of options. Or how about tricksters who like to predict their opponent's attacks? Well, the cancel special action is basically what you're looking for. Cancel basically reduces the amount of cards in your opponent's hand, meaning that you have an easier time taking advantage of your opponent's lack of options, as well as predicting the opponent's played cards. Overall, this special action is greatly beneficial to characters like Eric and Joel, who like to predict as well as counter opponent options. And finally, characters that require a lot of positioning, and I mean a lot of positioning, while being immensely immobile, really lean towards using pulse. These sorts of characters are characters that don't have a lot of movement but require to stay at range or at specific ranges. These are long-range characters like Rook, or maybe Byron, or maybe Agena. Though Agena is a different kind of positioning character who wants to be close instead of far. These types of characters basically have poor stats and poor options, that they can't basically do it on their own, and this is where Pulse shines the most, as it allows you to deny your opponent their attack, as well as getting into the position that makes your character absolutely unfair, quote-unquote. So, Rangers, Positioners, and sometimes Tricksters, but most of all, marker-based characters really benefit from this special action a lot, so watch out for that. Number 5. Quite honestly, the most important thing is to just play the game more. Knowing more about the game, as well as knowing your opponent's matchups and knowing your matchups, can heavily dictate what special action you decide to do. One key example, for example, is fighting against a Magdalena. Magdalena is this character who levels up a lot and using specific cards. And sometimes, and most of the time, I mean, she only levels up through time, but she can accelerate that using specific cards. You can stop her from doing those by either canceling or pulsing them, making it so that her leveling tempo and her leveling rotation is absolutely messed up, making it so that she doesn't level up as fast as she wanted to. This one example right here just speaks volumes about how knowing the matchup and knowing your opponent can affect the way you play your special action. So I highly suggest just playing the game and enjoying, and quite frankly, after a few games, you'll get comfortable with the special action, and trust me, you'll never forget it again. Thank you all so much for watching this episode of Battle Tips. I hope to bring you guys another episode for the Armory. This episode of Battle Tips was actually one of the prize videos that I had really long ago for the Voco video, if you guys remember any of that. So they wanted me to talk about the special action in general, which is very interesting, because I've been telling everybody to never forget it, but I've never actually told anybody how to use it properly. So hopefully this guide and this tutorial has taught all of you how to use your special action properly, and I hope you guys all enjoyed. Thank you, World of Indians. Thank you, and good night.